I drove a drunk girl home one night. The next morning, I found out she was my boss's daughter. I sat there in my truck for a long time after she went inside, engine off, hands still on the wheel, like I was waiting for something to make sense. There was a faint trace of her perfume still hanging in the passenger seat. I didn't know it yet, but that was the night everything in my life quietly started to change. My name is Tyler Brennan. I'm 33 years old, and I run operations at the loading dock for Sheridan Freight and Logistics out of Denver, Colorado. If you've ever driven past a warehouse district at 5 in the morning and seen one guy already there with a coffee going cold on the hood of a forklift, that was probably me. I live alone. I have for 2 years now, ever since my marriage ended. I don't like to dwell on the details when I tell this story because honestly, they don't matter much anymore. We just wanted different things out of life, and we were honest enough with each other to admit it before it turned into something uglier. No kids, just an apartment that echoed a little too much for the first few months, and a routine I built to fill the quiet. Every morning, rain or shine, I run along the South Platte River before the sun's all the way up. It's not for my health, though I tell people that. It's because if I don't move my body first thing, my mind starts wandering into places I'd rather not go. Running keeps me steady. Work keeps me steady too, in its own way. There's something honest about a warehouse at dawn. Before the noise starts, before the phones ring just me, the cold concrete, and a to-do list that doesn't ask anything of me except to show up and do the work. My apartment is small, functional, a little too quiet some nights. I've got a couch, a decent television, a kitchen I actually use, and not much else. I never bothered filling the space back up after the divorce. I told myself it was because I hadn't found the time, but the truth is probably simpler than that. I just wasn't sure yet what kind of life I wanted to build in that quiet. So I left it mostly empty and waited. I've been at Sheridan Freight for almost 7 years. I started on the floor, moving pallets, and worked my way into coordinating the whole operations, side scheduling, inventory, dock management, the parts of the business that never stop and never get much credit. My world is the warehouse. Concrete floors, forklift horns, the smell of diesel and cardboard. I rarely go upstairs to where the executives sit. There's an invisible line in that building between the people who run the trucks and the people who run the company, and I've always been fine on my side of it. Robert Sheridan owns the company. He built it from 3 trucks and a single warehouse 30 years ago, and now it's one of the largest freight operations in the state. He comes down to the floor sometimes, walks the aisles, shakes hands. He's the kind of boss who remembers your name and asks about your week and actually means it. I respect him. I always have. Men like that are rare in this industry, where a lot of owners forget what it feels like to stand on a concrete floor for 10 hours straight. There's a woman on my team named Natalie. She works inventory coordination, 1 row over from my office. She's quiet, always the first one in every morning, always the last to leave when something needs fixing. She signs her paperwork with initials N, Sheridan, which I never thought twice about, because half the people in that building sign their names in some shorthand or another. She's polite, a little reserved, easy to work with. I couldn't have told you much more about her than that. That was about to change. Sheridan Freight was holding its annual company dinner that Friday night, the kind of event where the warehouse crew and the office staff and a few outside partners all get thrown into the same room for one evening a year. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I just figured I'd show up, shake a few hands, eat some bad chicken, and go home early like I always did. I had no idea that night would end with me driving a stranger home, and that stranger turning out to be someone I already knew, just not in the way I thought I did. Looking back, I think that's usually how the important nights work. They never announce themselves ahead of time. They just show up dressed like any other Friday. The dinner was held at a banquet hall the company rented out downtown, the kind of place with too much gold trim and not enough parking. About 150 people showed up: floor staff, office staff, a handful of partners from outside vendors. I got there a little after 7, found a seat near the back with a few guys from the dock crew, and settled in for what I figured would be a fairly forgettable evening. It didn't stay forgettable for long. Halfway through dinner, Robert stood up at the front of the room and made an announcement. None of us were expecting a restructuring plan, some departments being consolidated, some roles being reevaluated in the new year. He kept his tone calm, reassuring, the way a good leader does when he's trying not to spook a room full of people who depend on their paychecks. But you could feel the air shift. A lot of quiet conversations started happening at every table. I noticed Natalie a few tables over. She wasn't at the executive table, she never sat there, but I could see her face had gone pale during the announcement. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured everyone in that room was doing the same math I was, wondering what it meant for them. As the night went on, she started drinking more than I'd ever seen her drink at any of these things. I wasn't watching her closely or anything, I just happened to notice, the way you notice things in a room full of people you sort of know. By the time the dinner wound down and people started filtering out to the parking lot, she was clearly not in any shape to drive. 2 of her coworkers offered to take her home. I saw it happen from a few feet away, out near the coat check. She shook her head both times, polite but firm, and her eyes kept drifting toward the exit, toward the parking lot, toward where I was standing pulling my jacket on. I didn't understand what that meant then. I understand it now. I walked outside into the cold and found her sitting on the curb near the entrance, alone, her arms wrapped around her knees, looking like she was trying very hard to hold herself together. Something in me just moved before I decided to let it. I've never been able to walk past somebody who needs help and pretend I didn't see them. It's not heroism, it's just how I was raised. "You okay?" I asked, crouching down next to her. She looked up at me, blinking slowly, like she was trying to figure out if I was really there. "I'm fine," she said. In that particular way. People say it when they are very much not fine. "Just needed some air. You got a ride home?" She shook her head. The wind picked up and she shivered, and that settled it for me. "Come on," I said. "I'll drive you. You can get your car tomorrow." She didn't argue. She just nodded and let me help her up. And we walked to my truck together, her leaning into my arm more than she probably meant to. Once we were on the road, she gave me directions in a soft, slurred voice, not to the address I might have expected, but to a small apartment complex on the other side of town, the kind of place a young professional rents when they're starting out on their own. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I have? Nothing about that night gave me any reason to think she was anything other than a coworker who'd had a rough evening and needed a ride. "Turn left up here," she murmured, her head resting against the window. Streetlights slid across her face in slow orange waves. The radio was on low, some old song neither of us was really listening to. "You always look so tired," she said suddenly, out of nowhere, her eyes half closed. "Someone should take care of you too, you know." I laughed it off. The way you do when someone who's had too much to drink says something a little too honest. "I'm all right," I told her. "Let's just get you home safe." She didn't say anything else after that, just leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Somewhere along the drive, as she shifted in her seat, a small faded blue hair tie slipped out of her hair and landed on the console between us. I noticed it, but I didn't think anything of it. I just left it there, figuring she'd grab it when we arrived. When we pulled up outside her building, I walked her to the door to make sure she got inside okay. She thanked me, quietly, almost shyly, and disappeared behind the door. I sat in my truck afterward for a long moment, the hair tie still sitting there on the console, before I finally drove home myself. The next morning, I had to bring some inventory reports up to the executive floor, something I hardly ever did. As I stepped off the elevator, I saw Natalie standing near one of the offices, talking to Robert Sheridan, and then I heard her say it, plain as day, in a voice that stopped me cold. "Thanks, Dad. I'll take care of it." I stood there frozen for a second, the folder of reports suddenly feeling very heavy in my hands. Dad. Robert Sheridan was her father, the woman I'd driven home the night before, the one who fell asleep against my truck window, the one whose hair tie was still sitting in my cup holder. She was my boss's daughter. I don't know how long I stood there before I remembered to keep walking. I dropped off the reports without saying much of anything useful, and I rode the elevator back down, replaying the entire night in my head, searching for anything I might have said or done that I needed to worry about. I couldn't find anything. I'd just been a decent person on an ordinary night. But something about knowing who she was made the whole thing feel different, heavier, like the ground, under a familiar path, had shifted slightly, without warning. Over the weeks that followed, our paths started crossing more than they used to. She'd come down to the warehouse with a reason, a shipment discrepancy, a paperwork question, and she'd end up near my office with 2 cups of coffee, handing me one like it was the most natural thing in the world. I returned the hair tie to her one afternoon, dropping it on her desk without much comment. She looked at it, then at me, and something passed between us that neither of us said out loud. We never talked about the night of the dinner directly. We didn't need to. Trust built itself quietly, in small moments, a shared laugh over a shipping error, a conversation that ran 15 minutes longer than it needed to, the way she started saving me a seat at the monthly staff meetings without ever mentioning that she was doing it. I found myself looking forward to seeing her in a way I hadn't let myself look forward to anything in a long time. I didn't say that out loud either. Some things you just carry quietly, until you're ready to look at them directly. I noticed little things about her that I hadn't before, now that I was actually paying attention. The way she double-checked every number on a shipping manifest twice, even when she already knew it was right. The way she said thank you to the forklift drivers by name, every single time, like it cost her nothing, and meant everything. I started to understand that whoever her father was, and whatever last name sat quietly on the other side of her signature, she'd built her own reputation on that warehouse floor with nothing but consistency and effort. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. There were mornings I caught myself glancing toward the loading doors a little too often, waiting to see if she'd come through them. I didn't call it anything back then. I just let it exist, unnamed, somewhere in the back of my mind, the way you let a song stay stuck in your head without asking why you keep humming it. Looking back, I think some part of me already knew what it was. I just wasn't ready to say the word out loud yet, not even to myself. About 4 months after the dinner, a woman named Paige Colton started showing up around Sheridan Freight more regularly. She represented one of our shipping partners, and I recognized her the second I saw her walk through the warehouse doors. Because Paige and I had been engaged once, a long time before my marriage, back when we were both a lot younger, and a lot more certain about things that turned out not to be true. She'd been at that same company dinner 4 months earlier, representing her firm at one of the vendor tables. I hadn't spoken to her that night. We'd exchanged maybe a nod across the room, but I found out later that she'd seen me leave with Natalie, the 2 of us walking out to the parking lot together at the end of the evening. Paige never forgot a detail like that. She never had. Paige and I had ended things years before my marriage even started. Back when we were both still figuring out who we wanted to become. She left for a bigger opportunity in another city, and I didn't blame her for it then, and I don't blame her for it now. People chase the things they think will make them whole. She'd always been ambitious in a way that filled up every room she walked into, loud in her confidence, quick to notice who held influence and who didn't. It wasn't a flaw, exactly. It was just who she was, and it was part of why things hadn't worked between us in the first place. At first, her presence around the office was just uncomfortable in the ordinary way. Old relationships are uncomfortable. A few too long looks in meetings. A comment here and there that only I would understand the weight of. I told myself it would pass, that she had a job to do and so did I, and eventually we'd settle into being 2 professionals who used to know each other. That's not what happened. Around the same time, I'd started taking on more responsibility at work, bigger projects, more direct contact with Robert, a level of trust that had clearly been building for a while. I didn't think much of it. I'd been putting in the work for years. But Paige noticed, the way she noticed everything, and she started connecting dots that weren't really connected. I heard about it secondhand first. One of the shift managers pulled me aside after a Tuesday morning meeting and mentioned, carefully, that people were talking. Paige had made a comment in a smaller planning meeting, something about how funny it was that I always seemed to end up close to the people who mattered. She hadn't said Natalie's name outright. She hadn't needed to. Funny how you always end up where the money is, Tyler. was the exact phrase that eventually made its way back to me, second-hand and then third-hand, the way rumors do, in a building full of people who talk to each other more than they realize. I didn't say anything to Paige directly. Some part of me hoped ignoring it would let it die out on its own. It didn't. A comment like that doesn't stay in one hallway. It travels, and in a company where Robert Sheridan sat on the top floor and heard things eventually, no matter how carefully people tried to keep them contained, it was only a matter of time before it reached him. I remember lying awake one night trying to figure out how something so ordinary, a ride home, nothing more, had turned into a story with an angle to it, a story about a man calculating his way toward the boss's favor. It didn't matter how many times I replayed that night in my head. There was nothing in it to be ashamed of, but shame has never needed the truth's permission to show up uninvited, and for a few days, it sat with me anyway. I thought about confronting Paige directly, more than once. But every time I got close to it, I talked myself out of it, worried it would only add more fuel to whatever story was already spreading. Sometimes the hardest thing to do with a rumor is nothing at all, just letting it run its course while you keep showing up and doing your job the same way you always have. It reached him through a board member, someone who'd heard the story secondhand, from a manager who'd heard it from someone else entirely, the details shifting a little more with every retelling, until it sounded less like a man giving a coworker a ride home, and more like something calculated, something with an angle to it. I noticed the shift in Natalie before I understood the cause. She started keeping her distance, shorter conversations, fewer visits to the warehouse, a kind of careful politeness that felt worse than if she'd just been cold to me outright. I didn't know what I'd done. I ran back through every conversation we'd had, trying to find where I'd made a mistake, and I came up empty every time. The mornings felt different that week. The coffee didn't get delivered to my office anymore. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that people get busy, that I was reading meaning into something that probably had none. But some part of me already knew better. Something had reached her. And whatever it was, it had put a wall up between us that I didn't know how to take down because I didn't even know what it was made of yet. Then Robert called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. I remember the specific weight of walking up those stairs, past the invisible line I'd respected for 7 years, into the part of the building that had never really been mine to occupy. His door was open. He gestured for me to sit down, and I did, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The clock on his wall ticked louder than I remembered clocks ever being able to tick. "I need to hear something from you directly," he finally said, his voice even, not angry, but serious in a way I hadn't heard from him before. Not from a hallway, not from somebody who heard it from somebody else. From you. I knew exactly what he meant before he said another word. My mind ran through every possible way this conversation could go, and none of them felt good. I thought about 7 years of work, about the trust I'd built with this man, one honest report at a time, and I wondered if all of it was about to come down to a single misunderstood evening. "There's a story going around," he continued, "about a night a few months back. About you and my daughter." I sat there for a moment, feeling the full weight of the situation settle onto my shoulders. I thought about my promotion review, the one that had quietly been in motion for months before any of this happened, built entirely on years of work that had nothing to do with Natalie at all. I thought about how easy it would be for one distorted story to undo something I'd spent 7 years building. And then I thought about Natalie, sitting somewhere in that building, probably just as confused and unsettled as I was, and I knew there was only one way to handle this. The truth, laid out plainly, with nothing softened and nothing hidden. I sat up a little straighter, steadying my breathing, reminding myself that I had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. Whatever this conversation cost me, at least it would cost me the truth and nothing less than that. "Ask me anything," I told him. "I'll tell you exactly what happened." So I told him. All of it, start to finish, without leaving anything out. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be, considering how much was riding on it. The dinner, the restructuring announcement that had clearly shaken her, the way she'd turned down 2 other coworkers before I found her sitting on the curb outside. I told him about the drive, about her giving me directions to her apartment rather than any address he might have expected, about how she'd fallen asleep against the window before I ever got her home safely. I didn't leave anything out, and I didn't add anything either. I've found that the truth, told plainly, usually sounds different from a rumor. It has fewer sharp edges, less drama built into it, because real life rarely needs the embellishment that gossip always seems to require. Robert listened without interrupting me once, his eyes steady on mine the entire time, and I got the sense he was listening not just to the words but to whether I flinched anywhere while saying them. I didn't drive her home to get close to you, Robert, I said, meeting his eyes the whole time. I drove her home because no one else would, and because I wasn't going to leave someone in that condition sitting alone on a curb. That's the whole story. There's nothing else to it. He was quiet for a long moment after that, studying me the way a man studies someone he's trying to decide whether to trust completely or not at all. Then he nodded, slowly, and some of the tension went out of his shoulders. I already pulled your review file before I called you in here, he said. Your promotion has nothing to do with any of this. That decision was made months ago, based on work you did long before that dinner ever happened. I just needed to hear the rest of it from you, because I wasn't going to let a rumor decide what I believed about a man I've trusted for 7 years. I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in days. I thanked him, and he waved it off, telling me to get back to work like none of it had happened. But something had happened. Something had shifted, even if the outcome was the one I'd hoped for. What I didn't know, walking out of that office, was that Natalie had been standing just outside the door the entire time, close enough to hear everything through the gap where it hadn't quite latched shut. She told me later that she'd come up to speak with her father about something unrelated and had frozen in the hallway the moment she heard my voice through the door, unable to make herself walk away. She heard all of it. She heard me defend the truth without flinching, without trying to make myself look better than I was, without once mentioning her name in a way that could have made things easier for me and harder for her. And somewhere in that hallway, listening to me tell her father the plain, unremarkable truth, she said she finally understood something about herself that she'd been avoiding for over a year. She told me later that standing there, frozen against the wall outside her father's office, she felt something shift loose inside her, a kind of quiet relief mixed with something closer to shame, the realization that she'd let a rumor nearly convince her to walk away from someone who had never once given her a reason to doubt him. She said she'd spent days being careful with me, guarded, telling herself it was smarter that way, and hearing me speak so plainly to her father had made all of that carefulness feel suddenly unnecessary. That evening, she found me in the parking lot outside the warehouse, waiting by my truck the way she had that first night, except this time she was steady on her feet, clear-eyed, and nervous in a completely different way. She was holding the faded blue hair tie in her hand, turning it over between her fingers. I wasn't lying that night, she said, before I could say anything at all. I really had too much to drink. The announcement scared me more than I wanted to admit, and I made a bad decision about how many drinks it took to get through it. That part was real. She paused, looking down at the hair tie, then back up at me. But I could have let either of those two people from my department drive me home. I said no both times. I waited, because some part of me was hoping it would be you. I've felt something for you for a long time, Tyler, longer than I probably should have let myself. I just never had a reason to say it, and then I had every reason to hide it. The wind was picking up, the way it does in Denver at the start of autumn, sharp and clean and a little unforgiving. The streetlight above us buzzed and flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. I looked at her for a long moment, taking in everything she'd just told me, letting it settle instead of rushing to fill the silence with something easy. Somewhere behind her, the warehouse sat dark and quiet for the night, the same building where we'd spent months circling each other without either of us saying the thing that mattered most. I didn't have a perfect response ready. I don't think perfect responses exist for moments like that, so I just reached out and took her hand, the one still holding the hair tie, and held it there between us. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Some conversations get finished in silence better than they ever could in words. What happened after that didn't move quickly, and I'm grateful for that now. We didn't announce anything to the office. We didn't change how we acted around each other at work. We just started spending time together outside of it, dinners that ran long, quiet walks along the river. I used to run alone. Conversations that picked up again the next day, exactly where we'd left them off. It felt less like the beginning of something dramatic, and more like something settling gently into place, the way a house settles into its foundation over time. Some evenings we didn't talk about anything important at all. We'd sit on her balcony with takeout containers between us, arguing over which route was faster across town, or she'd tell me about some ridiculous shipping error from years back that still made her laugh every time she retold it. I found myself relaxing into her company in a way I hadn't relaxed into anything since long before my marriage ended. There was no performance to it. She never needed me to be anything other than exactly who I already was, and I think that was the first time in years I'd felt that from anyone. I met a few of her closer friends eventually, people who'd known her long before Sheridan Freight, and they told me things about her that filled in gaps I hadn't known were there, how hard she'd worked to build her position on merit rather than her last name, how she'd nearly turned down the job entirely out of fear people would assume the worst about how she got it. Hearing that made the whole picture of her make more sense to me. She'd spent years trying to be seen clearly, on her own terms, and I understood then why the rumor about the two of us had frightened her as much as it had. Paige drifted out of the picture over the following months, not because of anything either Natalie or I did, but because of something entirely separate. A routine audit of vendor shipping records turned up inconsistencies in the paperwork her firm had been submitting for nearly a year. Errors serious enough that Sheridan Freight quietly declined to renew the contract when it came up for review. I heard about it the same way everyone else did, through the ordinary channel of company updates. Nothing more dramatic than that. She stopped coming around after that, and eventually I heard she'd moved on to a different company altogether. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I just felt like a chapter had closed on its own, without needing my help to close it. 10 months after that company dinner, Robert called a full staff meeting and announced my promotion to Director of Operations in front of the entire company. He made a point of explaining, clearly and without hesitation, that the decision had been under review since the spring, based entirely on years of performance data that had nothing to do with anything that happened outside of work. I appreciated that he said it out loud, in front of everyone, so there would never be a question hanging over it. Nobody in that room needed to wonder whether I'd earned it. Robert made sure of that. Natalie was in the crowd that day, standing near the back with the rest of the warehouse team, and when I looked over at her afterward, she just smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need any words attached to it. A few of the guys from the dock crew clapped me on the back afterward, and one of them joked that I'd finally get an office with a door that actually closed. I laughed along with them, but the whole time, my eyes kept drifting back to Natalie across the room, and I think everyone standing near me noticed exactly where my attention was. Later that week, when I told her I was still a little uneasy about people talking, still a little worried about what conclusions they might draw, watching the two of us together now that it was no longer a secret, she just shook her head. "You never had to prove anything to me, Tyler," she said. "I already knew who you were the night you drove me home. Everyone else just needed a little more time to catch up. The seasons kept turning the way they do. I remember one particular evening in late autumn, the air thick with the smell of burning leaves from somewhere down the block, sitting in my backyard, while Natalie laughed at something on her phone, tying her hair back with that same faded blue hair tie, worn even softer now than it had been the night it first fell onto the console of my truck. I watched her do it without saying anything, just letting the moment exist the way it was, uncomplicated and warm, and I remember thinking that this, right here, was the kind of ordinary happiness I'd stopped expecting to find again. We didn't rush toward anything bigger than what we had. We let it build the way good things build, slowly, without forcing a single piece of it. There was no dramatic proposal, no grand gesture, no moment designed for anyone but the two of us, just a steady accumulation of ordinary evenings that started to feel less like moments and more like a life. Her father never once brought up that first night again, and I think that silence, coming from a man who noticed everything, was its own kind of blessing. There was no single moment where I decided this was becoming something permanent. It was more like waking up one ordinary Tuesday and realizing I already knew, without needing to think about it, that she was the last person I wanted to talk to before falling asleep and the first person I wanted to see when I woke up. Some kinds of certainty don't arrive with fireworks. They just arrive quietly and stay. 13 months after that first night in the parking lot outside the banquet hall, we sat together on the front porch of the house I'd since bought. The kind of quiet Colorado evening where the whole sky turns orange before it turns dark. Natalie leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she had against the truck window that very first night, except this time she was wide awake, steady, and exactly where she wanted to be. The hair tie was still there, holding her hair back, no longer something forgotten on a console but something she'd chosen to keep, on purpose, every single day since. I didn't say much that evening. I didn't need to. I just sat there with her, watching the sky change color, thinking about how strange it was that the whole thing had started with me trying to do one small, decent thing for someone I barely knew. Looking back on it now, from where I'm standing, I understand the whole story in a way I never could have that first night in the truck. I almost missed something important, all because I didn't recognize the small signs that were right in front of me the entire time. Natalie chose silence for over a year, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was afraid that saying it out loud might cost her the only version of closeness she already had. That night, I only thought I was making sure a stranger got home safely. I didn't know that the same person was quietly leading me back toward a version of my own life I'd stopped believing I still had access to. I think about that faded blue hair tie sometimes, sitting wherever it sits now in our house, and how something so small managed to hold an entire story together without either of us realizing it at the time. It's funny what ends up mattering most. Looking back, never the big, loud moments you expect, but the quiet ones you almost let slip past you without a second glance. A ride home on an ordinary Friday, a hair tie left on a console, a truth spoken plainly in an office with the door left open. Have you ever realized, looking back, that someone had been quietly caring about you long before you ever noticed it yourself? And if you were in my position, would you have had the courage to tell the truth, plainly and completely, even knowing it might cost you everything you'd worked for? If this story meant something to you, give it a like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments about a moment in your own life when the truth turned out to be the only thing worth holding on to. I'll be reading every one of them,